Hello and welcome to this Southampton Philosophy for Schools explainer video on the Kalām Cosmological Argument. In an earlier video I talked about the class of arguments known as cosmological arguments for the existence of God, and this Kalām Cosmological Argument is a variation on that type of argument. It's actually an ancient Islamic argument for the existence of God, but it's been recently revamped and repackaged by William Lane Craig, who uses it to argue for the existence of the Christian God. So we'll start by talking about what the argument is. It's a little bit complicated, so we'll talk about that in a bit of detail, and then very briefly we'll talk about some ways that we might object to the argument. Okay, so what's the argument? Well, the Kalām Cosmological Argument starts with the premise that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. So note that that's subtly different from the first premise of most cosmological arguments, which say that everything that exists has a cause. So what's important about the cosmological argument is this focus on beginning to exist. Okay. The second premise says that the universe began to exist, and in support of that second premise, there are two sub-arguments. The first focuses on the impossibility of an actual infinite, and the second on the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition. And in a moment, I'll talk through what we mean by an actual infinite and how these sub-arguments work. Finally, the conclusion of the argument is that the universe has a cause of its existence and that cause is God. And depending on which tradition you use this argument in order to prove the existence of God in, you might specify that the cause of the universe is a particular kind of God. But most people agree that we can't really get that out of the argument itself. So the kind of God that you might think that this argument justifies the existence of is a kind of further question that isn't settled by the argument itself. Okay, so let's talk about some key points. So as I said a moment ago, the argument focuses on beginning to exist. And the idea is that unlike the universe itself, God plausibly doesn't begin to exist. So you might think of God as the kind of thing that exists eternally, that never had a start, a beginning of his or her existence. And that's important in this version of the argument because it avoids some of the most common objections to other versions of the cosmological argument, which say, one, that perhaps we might need to look for a sufficient reason for the existence of God, right? And in this case, if God is not something that begins to exist, we don't need to look for a cause or a reason for the existence of God. And second, another objection to the other versions of the cosmological argument says that it might have been that the universe exists necessarily and so isn't the kind of thing for which we need to look for a sufficient reason or a cause. And according to this version of the cosmological argument, this Kalām cosmological argument, what's important is that the universe begins to exist, and part of the argument is justifying this idea that the universe begins to exist. And so it's not the case then that the universe exists necessarily. Okay, so let's talk about these sub-arguments in a little bit more detail then. So as I said, the Kalām cosmological argument includes two sub-arguments in support of the second premise. So those are arguments for the claim that the universe began to exist. And note that according to William Lane Craig, we have other reasons too to believe that the universe begins to exist. And those reasons come from contemporary cosmology. So most physicists think that the Big Bang was the start of the existence of the universe. But Craig doesn't want for his argument to be sort of hostage to fortune. So if it turned out that science no longer could confirm that the Big Bang was the start of the universe, Craig thinks his argument would still stand because he's going to offer these philosophical arguments for thinking that the universe began to exist, whether or not it began with the Big Bang. So let's talk first about what we mean by actual and potential infinity. So the arguments say that an actual infinite is impossible and that it's impossible to form an actual infinite by successive addition. So let's think about what we mean by an actual versus a potential infinity. So a potential infinity is an idea of the infinite where we come closer and closer to infinity, but we never actually reach it. So here's a way to think about that. Try just now to think about how it would go if you tried to count to infinity, right? You start at 1, 2, 3, you go on and on and on and on, and you just keep saying bigger and bigger and bigger numbers, but you're never going to actually get to the point where you say a number and then the next number is infinity, right? That's just not how infinity works. That's just a misunderstanding of what infinity is. There's no such number as infinity that we just reach if we keep counting for long enough. Or another way to think about this is if you imagine a line and you keep dividing it. So you divide it in half and then you divide it again and again and again and again. You're never going to reach the point at which you've divided the line an infinite number of times, because you can always just divide the line one more time, right? And so we can't arrive at an actual infinity of times that we've divided the line. All we ever get is kind of moving towards infinity as we do it more and more and more and more and more. An actual infinity, in contrast, is like a completed infinite process all at once. So suppose that I had a bag which had an infinite number of marbles in it, right? That wouldn't be a potentially infinite number of marbles because I'm not putting the marbles in my bag and trying to get to have an infinite number of marbles in my bag. What I'm telling you now is this bag here contains an infinite number of marbles. Now, of course, you might think that that's impossible, but if it were possible, the kind of infinity that would be contained within my bag is an actual infinity because it's an entire infinite amount of marbles in the bag all at once, right? There's nothing kind of potential. We're not sort of trying to get to it. It's there already. Another way to think of it is to think of the set of all the natural numbers you might think is an example of an infinite set. So potential infinity involves trying to reach infinity by counting, whereas actual infinity is where we think about having an infinite set of something all at once. Okay, so why does that matter? Let's see when we talk about these sub-arguments in support of the second premise of the Kalām cosmological argument. So, lots of philosophers have argued that an actual infinity can't in fact exist. And there are some interesting paradoxes that arise if we try to think about the notion of an actual infinity. So here's one that belongs to a mathematician called David Hilbert. So imagine a normal hotel. If the hotel's full and a guest arrives and wants to stay at the hotel, then the people in reception have to say, no, I'm sorry, the hotel's full, there's nothing we can do. But now imagine an infinite hotel. A guest comes along and says, I'd like to stay at the hotel. And the people in reception say, oh, okay, well, that's no problem. We'll just move all the people in room 1 into room 2, and room 2 into room 3, so on and so forth, and then room 1 will become free. And that just seems really weird, right? The way that infinity works is such that it seems as though that ought to be possible, but the idea that we could do that seems to contain a kind of contradiction. And we can see it even more starkly when we realise that we ought to be able to make infinite numbers of rooms available in the hotel, because we can just move all the people in room 1 into room 3 and room 3 into room 5, right? Or we can move everybody from the room that they're in into the room that is is what you get if you multiply that room number by itself, right? So we can just generate kind of infinitely more rooms in our impossible hotel. Seems like nothing like that could really exist in reality. An infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinity. So suppose the universe hadn't begun to exist. Suppose the universe had existed infinitely. That means there would have been an infinite number of events that had already taken place. There would already have been an actual infinity, an actual infinite number of past temporal events. But if an actual infinity is impossible, then that couldn't have been the case. So there could have been no such thing as an infinite regress of events, and therefore the universe hasn't existed infinitely, because if it did, it would have to have had this kind of infinite regressive events. That's impossible. Therefore, Craig argues, the universe must have begun to exist, because an actual infinite is impossible, and an infinite series of temporal events would be an actual infinity. Okay, so that's the first sub-argument in support of the claim that the universe began to exist. The second sub-argument in support of that claim doesn't assume that an actual infinity is impossible. So I've just given you some reasons why you might think that an actual infinity is impossible, but you might not buy those reasons. You might think that an actual infinity is super weird, but that's not to say that it's impossible. Maybe you don't think that we can adjudicate these things from our position. So the second sub-argument in support of the premise that says that the universe begins to exist is one where we don't assume that an actual infinity is impossible. What it says is that a collection formed by successive addition cannot be actually infinite. So when I talked about the distinction between actual and potential infinity, I said that potential infinity is the kind of thing that you get when you try to add things successively. You don't reach actual infinity in that way. The temporal series of past events is a collection formed by successive addition. So it seems as though if we wanted to go back and back and back in time and look what caused this, what caused this, what's caused this, what caused this, if the universe didn't have a beginning, we'd be able to continue to do that infinitely, but it would be a potential infinite if we keep looking at each prior event. We're considering this as a kind of temporal series, and so we're keeping on looking back and back and back for a cause, and that would be a potentially infinite series. So the temporal series of past events can't be an actual infinite. You don't get to an actual infinity by successive addition, and that should be kind of clear from what we've talked about already. Therefore, the argument goes, the universe began to exist. Okay, so those are our two sub-arguments in support of the second premise that says that the universe began to exist. Here's a reminder of the argument as a whole. We start with the claim that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. We've got two arguments in support of the claim that the universe began to exist. And then we've got our conclusion that the universe has a cause of its existence, and that cause is God. So, let's just talk really briefly about some ways that you might object to the argument. So, we've already said that we've already looked at some arguments for the second premise, and now I want to have a think about the first premise. So is it true, do you think, that everything that begins to exist has a cause? So can we conceive of the idea that something might begin to exist uncaused? Now, for sure, it's super weird. Things don't kind of pop into existence uncaused in general. But when we're thinking about the beginning of the universe, we're thinking about a very specific state. So it's the beginning of the universe is something that happens outside of space and time. Our ordinary laws of nature don't apply, right? Things seem to be so different in that state that it's hard to know whether we could be confident about the idea that things don't begin to exist uncaused. You might think that the universe as a whole is a candidate for being kind of special. And if that was the case, then you might have cause to worry about the first premise of Craig's argument that says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Finally, at the very end of the argument, we saw the question, we saw that Craig claims that the universe has a cause for its existence, and that cause is God. So you might wonder whether or not we have to think that cause is God. So perhaps the universe does have a cause of its existence, but you might think that cause could be something else. Maybe something supernatural, but you might think something really far removed from the Christian God to which Craig appeals, or you might think not something supernatural, maybe the existence of the universe had another natural cause. It's pretty hard to evaluate those kinds of arguments because you might think that being natural is just a matter for being part of our universe. But these are really significant and difficult questions that it doesn't seem are at this stage really settled. So those are a few ways in which you might think that we could resist Craig's Kalām cosmological argument, but nevertheless you might think that it's an improvement on standard cosmological arguments, or you might not. This is up to you. Okay, so I think that is all that I have to say about the Kalām cosmological argument. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.